The Canal and Leonora by Everil Worrell. Section 1. The Canal Part 1. Past the sleeping city, the river sweeps. Along its left bank, the old canal creeps. I did not intend that to be poetry, although the scene is poetic, somberly, gruesomely poetic like the poems of Poe. Too well I know it. Too often have I walked over the grass-grown path beside the reflections of black trees and tumble-down shacks and distant factory chimneys and the sluggish waters that move so slowly and cease to move at all. I shall be called mad, and I shall be a suicide. I shall take no pains to cover up my trail or to hide the thing that I shall do. What will it matter afterward, what they say of me? If they knew the truth, if they could vision, even dimly, the beings with whom I have consorted, if the faintest realization might be theirs of the thing I am becoming, and of the fate from which I am saving their city, then they would call me a great hero. But it does not matter what they call me, as I've said before. Let me write down the things I'm about to write down, and let them be taken as they will be taken, the last ravings of a madman. The city will be in mourning for the thing I shall have done, but its mourning will be of no consequence, beside that other fate from which I shall have saved it. I have always had a taste for nocturnal prowling. We as a race have grown too intelligent to take seriously any of the old instinctive fears that preserved us through preceding generations. Our sole remaining salvation, then, has come to be our tendency to travel in herds. We wander at night, but our objective is somewhere on the brightly lighted streets, or still somewhere where men do not go alone. When we travel far afield, it is in company. Few of my acquaintance, few in the whole city here, would care to ramble at midnight over the grass-grown path I have spoken of, not because they would fear to do so, but because such things are not being done. Well, it is dangerous to differ individually from one's fellows. It is dangerous to wander from the beaten road, and the fears that guarded the race in the dawn of time and through the centuries were real fears, founded on reality. A month ago I was a stranger here. I had just taken my first position. I was graduated from college only 3 months before, in the spring. I was lonely and likely to remain so for some time, for I have always been of a solitary nature, making friends slowly. I had received one invitation out, to visit the camp of a fellow employee in the firm for which I worked. A camp which was located on the farther side of the wide river, the side across from the city and the canal, where the bank was high and steep and heavily wooded, and little tents blossomed all around the water's edge. At night these camps were a string of sparkling lights and tiny leaping campfires, and the tinkle of music carried faintly far across the calmly flowing river. That far bank of the river was no place for an eccentric, solitary man to love. But the near bank, which would have been an eyesore to the campers had not the river been so wide, the near bank attracted me from my first glimpse of it. We embarked in a motorboat at some distance downstream, and swept up along the near bank, and then out and across the current. I turned my eyes backward. The murk of stagnant water that was the canal, the jumble of low buildings beyond it, the lonely, low-lying waste of the narrow strip of land between canal and river, the dark, scattered trees growing there. I intended to see more of these things. That weekend bored me, but I repaid myself no later than Monday evening, the first evening when I was back in the city, alone and free. I ate a solitary dinner immediately after leaving the office. I went to my room and slept from 7 until nearly midnight. I wakened naturally then, for my whole heart was set on exploring the alluring solitude I had discovered. I dressed, slipped out of the house and into the street, started the motor in my roadster which I had left parked at the curb, and drove through the lighted streets. I left behind that part of town which was thick with vehicles carrying people home from their evening engagements, and began to thread my way through darker and narrower streets. Once I had to back out of a cul-de-sac, and once I had to detour around a closed block. This part of town was not alluring, even to me. It was dismal without being solitary. But when I had parked my car on a rough, cobbled street that ran directly down into the inky waters of the canal and crossed a narrow bridge, I was repaid. A few minutes set my feet on the old towpath where mules had drawn riverboats up and down only a year or so ago. Across the canal now, as I walked upstream at a swinging pace, the miserable shacks where miserable people lived seemed to march with me, and then fell behind. They looked like places in which murders might be committed, every one of them. The bridge I had crossed was near the end of the city going north, as the canal marked its western extremity. 10 minutes of walking and the dismal shacks were quite a distance behind. The river was farther away in the strip of wasteland, much wider and more wooded, and tall trees across the canal marched with me, as the evil-looking houses had done before. Far and faint, the sound of a bell in the city reached my ears. It was midnight. I stopped, enjoying the desolation around me. It had the savor I had expected and hoped for. I stood for some time, looking up at the sky, watching the low drift of heavy clouds, which were visible in the dull, reflected glow from distant lights in the heart of the city, so that they appeared to have a lurid phosphorescence of their own. The ground under my feet, on the contrary, was utterly devoid of light. I had felt my way carefully, knowing the edge of the canal partly by instinct, partly by the even more perfect blackness of the water in it, and even holding pretty well to the path, because it was perceptibly sunken below the ground beside it. Now, as I stood motionless in this spot, my eyes upcast, my mind adrift with strange fancies, suddenly my feelings of satisfaction and well-being gave way to something different. Fear was an emotion unknown to me. For those things which make men fear, I had always loved. The graveyard at night was to me a charming place for stroll and meditation. But now the roots of my hair seemed to move upright on my head and along all the length of my spine. I was conscious of a prickling, tingling sensation, such as my forefathers may have felt in the jungle when the hair on their backs stood up as the hair of my head was doing now. Also, I was afraid to move, and I knew that there were eyes upon me, and that was why I was afraid to move. I was afraid of those eyes, afraid to see them, to look into them. All this while, I stood perfectly still, my face up-tilted toward the sky. But after a terrible mental effort, I mastered myself. Slowly, with an attempt to propitiate the owner of the unseen eyes by my casual manner, I lowered my own. I looked straight ahead at the softly swaying silhouette of the treetops across the canal as they moved gently in the cool night wind. At the mass of blackness that was those trees and the opposite shore. At the shiny blackness where the reflections of the clouds glinted vaguely and disappeared. That was the canal. And again I raised my eyes a little, for just across the canal, where the shadows massed most heavily, there was that at which I must look more closely. And now, as I grew accustomed to the greater blackness and my pupils expanded, I dimly discerned the contours of an old boat or barge half sunken in the water. An old abandoned canal boat. But was I dreaming, or was there a white-clad figure seated on the roof of the low cabin aft, a pale, heart-shaped face gleaming strangely at me from the darkness, the glow of two eyes seeming to light up the face and to detach it from the darkness? Surely there could be no doubt as to the eyes. They shone as the eyes of animals shine in the dark, with a phosphorescent gleam and a glimmer of red. Well, I had heard that some human eyes have that quality at night. But what a place for a human being to be. A girl, too, I was sure. That daintily heart-shaped face was the face of a girl, surely. I was seeing it clearer and clearer, either because my eyes were growing more accustomed to peering into the deeper shadows, or because of that phosphorescence in the eyes that stared back at me. I raised my voice softly, not to break too much the stillness of the night. "Hello, who's there? Are you lost or marooned, and can I help?" There was a little pause. I was conscious of a soft lapping at my feet. A stronger night wind had sprung up, was ruffling the dark waters. I had been overwarm, and where it struck me the perspiration turned cold on my body, so that I shivered uncontrollably. "You can stay and talk a while, if you will. I am lonely, but not lost. I live here." I could hardly believe my ears. The voice was little more than a whisper, but it had carried clearly. A girl's voice, sure enough. And she lived there, in an old, abandoned canal boat, half submerged in the stagnant water. "You are not alone there?" "No, not alone. My father lives here with me, but he is deaf, and he sleeps soundly." Did the night wind blow still colder, as though it came to us from some unseen frozen sea? Or was there something in her tone that chilled me, even as a strange attraction drew me toward her? I wanted to draw near to her, to see closely the pale, heart-shaped face, to lose myself in the bright eyes that I had seen shining in the darkness. I wanted to hold her in my arms, to find her mouth with mine, to kiss it. With a start, I realized the nature of my thoughts, and for an instant lost all thought and surprise. Never in my 22 years had I felt love before. My fancies had been otherwise directed. A moss-grown, fallen gravestone was a dearer thing to me to contemplate than the fairest face in all the world. Yet surely what I felt now was love. I took a reckless step nearer the edge of the bank. "Could I come over to you?" I begged. "It's warm, and I don't mind a wetting. It's late, I know, but I would give a great deal to sit beside you and talk, if only for a few minutes before I go back to town. It's a lonely place here for a girl like you to live. Your father should not mind if you exchange a few words with someone occasionally." Was it the unconventionality of my request that made her next word sound like a long-drawn shudder of protest? There was a strangeness in the tones of her voice that held me wondering every time she spoke. "No, no, oh no, you must not swim across." "Then could I come tomorrow or some day soon in the daytime? And would you let me come on board then? Or would you come on shore and talk to me perhaps?" "Not in the daytime. Never in the daytime." Again, the intensity of her low-toned negation held me spellbound. It was not her sense of the impropriety of the hour, then, that had dictated her manner. For surely any girl with the slightest sense of the fitness of things would rather have a tryst by daytime than after midnight. Yet there was an interference in her last words that, if I came again, it should be again at night. Still feeling the spell that had enthralled me, as one does not forget the presence of a drug in the air that is stealing one's senses, even when those senses begin to wander and to busy themselves with other things, I yet spoke shortly. "Why do you say never in the daytime? Do you mean that I may come more than this once at night? Though now you won't let me cross the canal to you at the expense of my own clothes, and you won't put down your plank or drawbridge, or whatever you come on shore with, and talk to me here for only a moment. I'll come again if you'll let me talk to you instead of calling across the water. I'll come again any time you will let me, day or night. I don't care. I want to come to you. But I only ask you to explain. If I came in the daytime and met your father, wouldn't that be the best thing to do? Then we would be really acquainted. We could be friends." "In the nighttime my father sleeps. In the daytime I sleep. How could I talk to you or introduce you to my father then? If you came on board this boat in the daytime, you would find my father, and you would be sorry. As for me, I would be sleeping. I could never introduce you to my father. Do you see?" "You sleep soundly, you and your father." Again there was pique in my voice. "Yes, we sleep soundly." "And always at different times?" "Always at different times. We are on guard. One of us is always on guard. We have been hardly used down there in your city, and we have taken refuge here, and we are always on guard." The resentment vanished from my breast, and I felt my heart go out to her anew. She was so pale, so pitiful in the night. My eyes were learning better and better how to pierce the darkness. They were giving me a more definite picture of my companion, if I could think of her as a companion, between myself and whom stretched the black water. The sadness of the lonely scene, the perfection of the solitude itself, these things contributed to her pitifulness. Then there was that strangeness of atmosphere of which even yet I had only partly taken note. There was the strange shivering chill, which yet did not seem like the healthful chill of a cool evening. In fact, it did not prevent me from feeling the oppression of the night, which was unusually sultry. It was like a little breath of deadly cold that came and went, and yet did not alter the temperature of the air itself, as the small ripples on the surface of water do not concern the water even a foot down. And even that was not all. There was an unwholesome smell about the night, a dank, moldy smell that might have been the very breath of death and decay. Even I, the connoisseur in all things dismal and unwholesome, tried to keep my mind from dwelling overmuch upon that smell. What it must be to live breathing it constantly in, I could not think. But no doubt the girl and her father were used to it, and no doubt it came from the stagnant water of the canal, and from the rotting wood of the old half-sunken boat that was their refuge. My heart throbbed with pity again. Their refuge. What a place! And my clearer vision of the girl showed me that she was pitifully thin, even though possessed of the strange face that drew me to her. Her clothes hung around her like old rags, but hers was no scarecrow aspect. Although little flesh clothed her bones were beautiful. I was sure the little pale heart-shaped face would be more beautiful still, if I could only see it closely. I must see it closely. I must establish some claim to consideration as a friend of the strange, lonely crew of the half-sunken wreck. "This is a poor place to call a refuge," I said finally. "One might have very little money and yet do somewhat better. Perhaps I might help you. I am sure I could. If your ill treatment in the city was because of poverty, I am not rich, but I could help that. I could help you a little with money if you would let me. Or in any case, I could find a position for you. I'm sure I could do that." The eyes that shone fitfully toward me, like two small pools of water, intermittently lit by a cloud-swept sky, seemed to glow more brightly. She had been half crouching, half sitting on top of the cabin. Now she leaped to her feet with one quick, sinuous, abrupt motion, and took a few rapid, restless steps to and fro before she answered. When she spoke, her voice was little more than a whisper, yet surely rage was in its shrill sibilance. "Fool! Do you think you would be helping me? To tie me to a desk? To shut me behind doors? Away from freedom? Away from the delight of doing my own will? Of seeking my own way? Never, never would I let you do that. Rather this old boat, rather a deserted grave under the stars, for my home." A boundless surprise swept over me, and a positive feeling of kinship with this strange being whose face I had hardly seen possessed me. So I myself might have spoken, so I had often felt, though I had never dreamed of putting my thoughts so definitely, so forcefully. My regularized daytime life was a thing I thought little of. I really lived only in my nocturnal prowlings. Why, this girl was right. All of life should be free, and spent in places that interested and attracted. How little I knew that night that dread forces were tugging at my soul, were finding entrance to it, an easy access through the morbid weakness of my nature. How little I knew at what a cost I deviated so radically from my kind, who herd in cities and love well-lit ways and the sight of man and sweet and wholesome places to be solitary in, when the desire for solitude comes over them. That night it seemed to me that there was but one important thing in life, to allay the angry passion my unfortunate words had aroused in the breast of my beloved, and to win from her some answering feeling. "I understand much better than you think," I whispered tremulously. "What I want is to see you again, to come to know you, and to serve you in any way that I may. Surely there must be something in which I can be of use to you. All you have to do from tonight on forever is to command me. I swear it." "You swear that? You do swear it?" Delighted at the eagerness of her words, I lifted my hand toward the dark heavens. "I swear it. From this night on, forever, I swear it." "Then listen. Tonight you may not come to me, nor I to you. I do not want you to board this boat. Not tonight. Not any night. And most of all, not any day. But do not look so sad. I will come to you. No, not tonight. Perhaps not for many nights. Yet, before very long, I will come to you there on the bank of the canal, when the water in the canal ceases to flow." I must have made a gesture of impatience or of despair. It sounded like a way of saying, never. For why should the water in the canal cease to flow? She read my thoughts in some way, for she answered them. "You do not understand. I am speaking seriously. I am promising to meet you there on the bank, and soon, for the water within these banks is moving slower, always slower, higher up. I have heard that the canal has been drained. Between these lower locks, the water still seeps in and drops slowly, slowly downstream. But there will come a night when it will be quite stagnant. And on that night I will come to you, and when I come I will ask you a favor, and you will keep your oath." End of Section 1, The Canal Part 1. It was all the assurance I could get that night. She had come back to the side of the cabin where she had sat crouched before, and she resumed again that posture and sat still and silent, watching me. Sometimes I could see her eyes upon me, and sometimes not, but I felt that their gaze was unwavering. The little cold breeze, which I had finally forgotten while I was talking with her, was blowing again, and the unwholesome smell of decay grew heavier before the dawn. She would not speak again, nor answer me when I spoke to her, and I grew nervous, and strangely ill at ease. At last I went away, and in the first faint light of dawn I slipped up the stairs of my rooming house and into my own room. I was deadly tired at the office next day, and day after day slipped away, and I grew more and more weary, for a man cannot wake day and night without suffering, especially in hot weather, and that was what I was doing. I haunted the old towpath and waited, night after night, on the bank opposite the sunken boat. Sometimes I saw my lady of the darkness, and sometimes not. When I saw her, she spoke little, but sometimes she sat there on the top of the cabin and let me watch her till the dawn, or until the strange uneasiness that was like fright drove me from her and back to my room, where I tossed restlessly in the heat and dreamed strange dreams, half waking, till the sun shone in on my forehead and I tumbled into my clothes and down to the office again. Once I asked her why she had made the fanciful condition that she would not come ashore to meet me until the waters of the canal had ceased to run. How eagerly I studied those waters, how I stole away at noontime more than once, not to approach the old boat, but to watch the almost imperceptible downward drift of bubbles, bits of straw, twigs, and rubbish. My questioning displeased her, and I asked her that no more. It was enough that she chose to be whimsical. My part was to wait. It was more than a week later that I questioned her again, this time on a different subject, and after that I curbed my curiosity relentlessly. "Never speak to me of things you do not understand about me. Never again, or I will not show myself to you again. And when I walk on the path yonder, it will not be with you." I had asked her what form of persecution she and her father had suffered in the city that had driven them out to this lonely place, and where in the city they had lived. Frightened seriously lest I lose the ground I was sure I had gained with her, I was about to speak of something else, but before I could find the words her low voice came to me again. It was horrible, horrible. Those little houses below the bridge, those houses along the canal. Tell me, are they not worse than my boat? Life there was shut in and furtive. I was not free as I am now. And the freedom I will soon have will make me forget the things I have not yet forgotten. The screaming, the reviling and cursing, fear and flight. As you pass back by those houses, think how you would like to be shut in one of them and in fear of your life. And then think of them no more, for I would forget them, and I will never speak of them again. I dared not answer her. I was surprised that she had vouchsafed me so much. But surely her words meant this, that before she had come to live on the decaying, water-rotted old boat, she had lived in one of those horrible houses I passed by on my way to her. Those houses, each of which looked like the predestined scene of a murder. As I left her that night, I felt that I was very daring. 1 or 2 nights more, and you will walk beside me, I called to her. I have watched the water at noon, and it hardly moves at all. I threw a scrap of paper into the canal, and it whirled and swung a little where a thin skim of oil lay on the water down there. Oil from the big dirty city you are well out of. But though I watched and watched, I could not see it move downward at all. Perhaps tomorrow night, or the night after, you will walk on the bank with me. I hope it will be clear in moonlight, and I will be near enough to see you clearly, as well as you seem always to see me in darkness or moonlight, equally well, and perhaps I will kiss you, but not unless you let me. And yet, the next day, for the first time, my thoughts were definitely troubled. I had been living in a dream. I began to speculate concerning the end of the path on which my feet were set. I had conceived from the first such a horror of those old houses by the canal. They were well enough to walk past, nursing gruesome thoughts for a midnight treat. But much as I loved all that was weird and eerie about the girl I was wooing so strangely, it was a little too much for my fancy that she had come from them. By this time I had become decidedly unpopular in my place of business. Not that I had made enemies, but that my peculiar ways had caused too much adverse comment. It would have taken very little, I think, to have made the entire office force decide that I was mad. After the events of the next 24 hours, and after this letter is found and read, they will be sure that they knew it all along. At this time, however, they were punctiliously polite to me, and merely let me alone as much as possible, which suited me perfectly. I dragged wearily through day after day, exhausted for lack of sleep, conscious of their speculative glances, living only for the night to come. But on this day, I approached the man who had invited me to the camp across the river, who had unknowingly showed me the way that led to my love. "Have you ever noticed the row of tumble-down houses along the canal on the city side?" I asked him. He gave me an odd look. I suppose he sensed the significance of my breaking silence after so long to speak of them, sensed that in some way I had a deep interest in them. "You have odd tastes, Morton," he said after a moment. "I suppose you wander into strange places sometimes. I've heard you speak of an enthusiasm for graveyards at night. But my advice to you is to keep away from those houses. They're unsavory, and their reputation is unsavory. Positively. I think you'd be in danger of your life if you go poking around there. They have been the scene of several murders, and a dope den or two has been cleaned out of them. Why in the world you should want to investigate them?" "I don't expect to investigate them," I said testily. "I was merely interested in them, from the outside. To tell you the truth, I had heard a story, a rumor, never mind where. But you say there have been murders there. I suppose this rumor I heard may have had to do with an attempted one. There was a girl who lived there with her father once, and they were set upon there or something of the sort and had to run away. Did you ever hear that story?" Barrett gave me an odd look such as one gives in speaking of a past horror so dreadful that the mere speaking of it makes it live terribly again. "What you say reminds me of a horrible thing that was said to have happened down there once," he said. "It was in all the papers. A little child disappeared in one of those houses, and a couple of poor lodgers who lived there, a girl and her father, were accused of having made away with it. They were accused they were accused. Oh, well, I don't like to talk about such things. It was too dreadful. The child's body was found. Part of it was found. It was mutilated, and the people in the house seemed to believe it had been mutilated in order to conceal the manner of its death. There was an ugly wound in the throat. It finally came out, and it seemed as if the child might have been bled to death. It was found in the girl's room, hidden away. The old man and his daughter escaped before the police were called. The countryside was scoured for them. The whole country was scoured, but they were never found. Why, you must have read it in the paper several years ago. I nodded with a heavy heart. I had read it in the papers. I remembered now. And again a terrible questioning came over me. Who was this girl? What was this girl, who seemed to have my heart in her keeping? Why did not a merciful God let me die then? Befogged with exhaustion, bemused in a dire enchantment, my mind was incapable of thought. And yet, some soul process akin to that which saves the sleepwalker poised at perilous heights sounded its warning now. My mind was filled with doleful images. There were women, I had heard and read, who slew to satisfy a bloodlust. There were ghosts, specters, call them what you will. Their names have been legion in the dark pages of that lore which dates back to the infancy of the races of the earth, who retained even in death this bloodlust. Vampires, they had been called that. I had read of them. Corpses by day, spirits of evil by night, roaming abroad in their own forms or in the forms of bats or unclean beasts, killing body and soul of their victims. For whoever dies of the repeated kiss of the vampire, which leaves its mark on the throat and draws the blood from the body, becomes a vampire also. Of such beings I had read. And horror of horrors, in that last cursed day at the office, I remembered reading of these vampires, these undead, that in their nocturnal flights they had one limitation. They could not cross running water. End of Section 2, The Canal Part 2. That night I went my usual nightly way with tears of weakness on my face, for my weakness was supreme, and I recognized fully at last the misery of being the victim of an enchantment stronger than my feeble will. But I went. I approached the neighborhood of the canal boat as the distant city clock chimed the first stroke of 12. It was the dark of the moon, and the sky was overcast. Heat lightning flickered low in the sky, seeming to come from every point of the compass and circumscribe the horizon, as if unseen fires burned behind the rim of the world. By its fitful glimmer I saw a new thing. Between the old boat and the canal bank stretched a long, slim, solid-looking shadow. A plank had been let down. In that moment I realized that I had been playing with powers of evil which had no intent now to let me go, which indeed were about to lay hold upon me with an inexorable grasp. Why had I come tonight? Why, but that the spell of the enchantment laid upon me was a thing more potent and far more unbreakable than any wholesome spell of love. The creature I sought out. Oh, I remembered now. With the cold perspiration beading my brow, the lore hidden away between the covers of the dark old book, which I had read so many years ago, and half forgotten, until dim memories of it stirred within me this last day and night. My lady of the night, no woman of wholesome flesh and blood and odd perverted tastes that matched my own, but one of the undead. In that moment I knew it, and knew that the vampires of old legends polluted still in these latter days the fair surface of the earth. And on the instant, behind me in the darkness, there was the crackle of a twig, and something brushed against my arm. This, then, was the fulfillment of my dream. I knew, without turning my head, that the pale, dainty face with its glowing eyes was near my own, that I had only to stretch out my arm to touch the slender grace of the girl I had so longed to draw near. I knew, and should have felt the rapture I had anticipated. Instead, the roots of my hair prickled coldly, unendurably, as they had on the night when I had first sighted the old boat. The miasmic odors of the night, heavy and oppressive with heat, and unrelieved by a breath of air, all but overcame me, and I fought with myself to prevent my teeth clicking in my head. The little waves of coldness I'd felt often in the spot were chasing over my body, yet they were not from any breeze. The leaves on the trees hung down motionless, as though they were actually wilting on their branches. With an effort, I turned my head. 2 hands caught me around my neck. The pale face was so near that I felt the warm breath from its nostrils fanning my cheek. And suddenly all that was wholesome in my perverted nature rose uppermost. I longed for the touch of the red mouth, like a dark flower opening before me in the night. I longed for it, and yet more I dreaded it. I shrank back, catching in a powerful grip the fragile wrists of the hands that strove to hold me. I must not yield to the faintness that I felt stealing languorously over me. I was facing down the path toward the city. A low rumble of thunder, the first, broke the torrid hush of the summer night. A glare of lightning seemed to tear the night asunder, to light up the whole universe. Overhead the clouds were careening madly in fantastic shapes, driven by a wind that swept the upper heavens without as yet causing even a trembling in the air lower down. And far down the canal, that baleful glare seemed to play around and hover over the little row of shanties, murder-cursed and haunted by the ghost of a dead child. My gaze was fixed on them, while I held away from me the pallid face and fought off the embrace that sought to overcome my resisting will. And so a long moment passed. The glare faded out of the sky, and a greater darkness took the world. But there was a nearer, more menacing glare fastened upon my face. The glare of 2 eyes that watched mine, that had watched me as I, unthinking, stared down at the dark houses. This girl, this woman, who had come to me at my own importunate requests, did not love me, since I had shrunk from her. She did not love me, but it was not only that. She had watched me as I gazed down at the houses that held her dark past, and I was sure that she divined my thoughts. She knew my horror of those houses. She knew my newborn horror of her. And she hated me for it. Hated me more malignantly than I had believed a human being could hate. And at that point in my thoughts, I felt my skin prickle and my scalp rise again. Could a human being cherish such hate as I read, trembling more and more in those glowing fires lit with what seemed to me more like the fires of hell than any light that ought to shine in a woman's eyes? And through all this, not a word had passed between us. So far I have written calmly. I wish that I could write on so to the end. If I could do that, there might be 1 or 2 of those who will regard this as the document of a maniac, who would believe the horrors of which I am about to write. But I am only flesh and blood. At this point in the happenings of the awful night, my calmness deserted me. At this point I felt that I had been drawn into the mist of a horrible nightmare, from which there was no escape, no waking. As I write, this feeling again overwhelms me, until I can hardly write at all, until, were it not for the thing which I must do, I would rush out into the street and run, screaming until I was caught and dragged away, to be put behind strong bars. Perhaps I would feel safe there. Perhaps. I know that, terrified at the hate I saw confronting me in those redly gleaming eyes, I would have slunk away. The 2 thin hands that caught my arm again were strong enough to prevent that, however. I had been spared her kiss. I was not to escape from the oath I had taken to serve her. "You promised. You swore," she hissed in my ear.
And tonight, you are to keep your oath."
I felt my senses reel. My oath. Yes, I had an oath to keep. I lifted my hand toward the dark heavens and swore to serve her in any way she chose, freely, and of my own volition I had sworn. I sought to evade her. "Let me help you back to your boat," I begged. "You have no kindly feeling for me, and you've seen it. I love you no longer. I will go back to the city. You can go back to your father and forget that I broke your peace." The laughter that greeted my speech I shall never forget. Not in the depths under the scummy surface of the canal. Not in the empty places between the worlds, where my tortured soul may wander.
"So you do not love me, and I hate you. Fool, have I waited these weary months for the water to stop only to go back now? After my father and I returned here and found the old boat rotting in the drained canal and took refuge in it, when the water was turned into the canal while I slept, so that I could never escape until its flow should cease, because of the thing that I am. Even then I dreamed of tonight, when the imprisonment we still shared ceased to matter to my father. Come on board the deserted boat tomorrow and see why, if you dare. Still I dreamed on of tonight. I've been lonely, desolate, starving. Now the whole world shall be mine, and by your help."
I asked her somehow what she wanted of me, and a madness overcame me so that I hardly heard her reply. Yet somehow I knew that there was that on the opposite shore of the great river, where the pleasure camps were, that she wanted to find. In the madness of my terror, she made me understand and obey her. I must carry her in my arms across the long bridge over the river, deserted in the small hours of the night. The way back to the city was long tonight. Long. She walked behind me, and I turned my eyes neither to right nor left. Only as I passed the tumble-down houses, I saw their reflection in the canal and trembled, so that I could have fallen to the ground at the thoughts of the little child this woman had been accused of slaying there, and at the certainty I felt that she was reading my thoughts. And now the horror that engulfed me darkened my brain. I know that we set our feet upon the long, wide bridge that spanned the river. I know that the storm broke there, so that I battled for my footing, almost for my life, it seemed, against the pelting deluge, and the horror I had invoked was in my arms, clinging to me, burying its head upon my shoulder. So increasingly dreadful had my pale-faced companion become to me that I hardly thought of her now as a woman at all, only as a demon of the night. The tempest raged still as she leaped down out of my arms on the other shore, and again I walked with her against my will, while the trees lashed their branches madly around me, showing the pale undersides of their leaves in the vivid, frequent flashes that rent the heavens. On and on we went, branches flying through the air and missing us by a miracle of ill fortune. Such as she and I are not slain by falling branches. The river was a welter of whitecaps, flattened down into strange shapes by the pounding rain. The clouds, as we glimpsed them, were like devils flying through the sky. Past dark tent after dark tent we stole, and past a few where lights burned dimly behind their canvas walls, and at last we came to an old quarry. Into its artificial ravine she led me, and up to a crevice in the rock wall.
"Reach in your hand and pull out the loose stone you will feel," she whispered. "It closes an opening that leads into deep caverns. A human hand must remove that stone. Your hand must move it."
Why did I struggle so to disobey her? Why did I fail? It was as though I knew. But my failure was foreordained. I had taken oath. End of The Canal, Part 3. If you who read have believed that I have set down the truth thus far, the little that is left you will call the ravings of a madman overtaken by his madness. Yet, these things happened. I stretched out my arm, driven by a compulsion I could not resist. At arm's length, in the niche in the rock, I felt something move. The loose rock. A long, narrow fragment, much larger than I had expected. Yet it moved easily, seeming to swing on a natural pivot. Outward it swung, toppling toward me. A moment more and there was a swift rush of the ponderous weight I had loosened. I leaped aside and went down, my forehead grazed by the rock. For a brief moment I must have been unconscious, but only for a moment. My head was a stabbing agony of pain, unreal lights flashing before my eyes. I yet knew the reality of the storm that beat me down as I struggled to my feet. I knew the reality of the dark, loathsome shapes that passed me in the dark, crawling out of the orifice in the rock and flapping through the wild night, along the way that led to the pleasure camps. So the caverns I had laid open to the outer world were infested with bats. I had been inside unlit caverns and had heard there the squeaking of the things, felt and heard the flapping of their wings. But never in all my life before had I seen bats as large as men and women. Sick and dizzy from the blow on my head and from disgust, I crept along the way they were going. If I touched one of them, I felt that I should die of horror. Now at last the storm abated, and a heavy darkness made the whole world seem like the inside of a tomb. Where the tents stood in a long row, the number of the monster bats seemed to diminish. It was as though, horrible thought, they were creeping into the tents with their slumbering occupants. At last I came to a lighted tent and paused, crouching so that the dim radiance that shone through the canvas did not touch me in the shadows. And there I waited, but not for long. There was a dark form silhouetted against the tent, a movement of the flap of the tent, a rustle and confusion, and the dark thing was again in silhouette, but with a difference in the quality of the shadow. The dark thing was inside the tent now, its bat wings extending across the entrance through which it had crept. Fear held me spellbound, and as I looked, the shadow changed again, imperceptibly, so that I could not have told how it changed. But now it was not the shadow of a bat, but of a woman. The storm! The storm! I am lost, exhausted. I crept in here to beg for refuge until the dawn. That low, thrilling, sibilant voice. Too well I knew it. Within the tent I heard a murmur of acquiescent voices. At last I began to understand. I knew the nature of the woman I had carried over the river in my arms, the woman who would not even cross the canal until the water should have ceased utterly to flow. I remembered books I had read, Dracula, other books and stories. I knew they were true books and stories now. I knew those horrors existed for me. I had indeed kept my oath to the creature of darkness. I had brought her to her kind, under her guidance. I had let them loose in hordes upon the pleasure camps. The campers were doomed, and through them, others. I forgot my fear. I rushed from my hiding place up to the tent door, and there I screamed and called aloud. Don't take her in! Don't let her stay, nor the others. They have crept into the other tents. Wake all the campers. They will sleep on to their destruction. Drive out the interlopers. Drive them out quickly. They are not human. No, and they are not bats. Do you hear me? Do you understand? I was fairly howling, in a voice that was strange to me. She is a vampire! They are all vampires! Vampires! Inside the tent I heard a new voice. What can be the matter with that poor man? The voice said. It was a woman's and gentle. Crazy. Somebody out of his senses, dear. A man's voice answered. Don't be frightened. And then the voice I knew so well. So well. I saw a rock strike a man on the head in the storm. He staggered away, but I suppose it crazed him. I waited for no more. I ran away, madly, through the night and back across the bridge to the city. Next day, Today, I boarded the sunken canal boat. It is the abode of death. No woman could have lived there, only such an one as she. The old man's corpse was there. He must have died long, long ago. The smell of death and of decay on the boat was dreadful. Again, I felt that I understood. Back in those awful houses, she had committed the crime when first she became the thing she is. And he, her father, less sin-steeped and less accursed, attempted to destroy the evidence of her crime and fled with her, but died without becoming like her. She had said that one of those two was always on watch. Did he indeed divide her vigil on the boat? What more fitting? The dead standing watch with the undead. And no wonder that she would not let me board the craft of death, even to carry her away. And still I feel the old compulsion. I have been spared her kiss, but for a little while. Yet I will not let the power of my oath to her draw me back, till I enter the caverns with her, and creep forth in the form of a bat to prey upon mankind. Before that can happen, I, too, will die. Today in the city I heard that a horde of strange insects of small animals infested the pleasure camps last night. Some said, with horror-bated breath, that they perhaps were rats. None of them were seen, but in the morning nearly every camper had a strange deep wound in his throat. I almost laughed aloud. They were so horrified at the idea of an army of rats creeping into the tents and biting the sleeping occupants on their throats. If they had seen what I saw, if they knew that they are doomed to spread corruption. So my own death will not be enough. Today I bought supplies for blasting. Today I will set my train of dynamite from the hole I made in the cliff where the vampires creep in and out, along the row of tents, as far as the last one. Then I shall light my fuse. It will be done before the dawn. Tomorrow the city will mourn its dead and execrate my name. And then at last in the slime beneath the unmoving waters of the canal, I shall find peace. But perhaps it will not be peace, for I shall seek it midway between the old boat with its cargo of death, and the row of dismal houses where a little child was done to death when first she became the thing she is. That is my expiation. End of The Canal, Part 4. I am writing this because I shall not long be able to write it. Why does one long for the understanding and sympathy of his fellow beings? Long to have that, even after the worst has befallen, and he has gone from this life to that which awaits him. How many bottles laden with last messages float on lonely, unknown ocean surges, or sink to the bottom of the sea? It will be so with this, my last message. That is, it will go uncredited, unbelieved, uncomprehended, although it will doubtless be read. But I've told my story many times, and heard them say that I am mad. I know they will say that, after I am gone from behind these bars into the horrors of the fate that will overtake my spirit somewhere out in the open spaces and the blackness of night into which it will go. He will be there, one of the shadows that lurk in old cemeteries and sweep across lonely roads where the winds moan and wander homeless and hopeless across the waste spaces of the earth from dusk till dawn. Dawn! But I will tell my story for the last time. Even now, my years are those of a young girl. I am only 17, and they say I have been mad more than a year. When I was 16, my eyes were bright and my cheeks red with a color that did not come off when I washed my face. I lived in the country, and I was an old-fashioned girl in many ways. I roamed freely over the countryside, and my wanderings were shared by my only close friend, or else were lonely. The name of my friend was Margaret. Mine was Leonora. The two of us lived only a quarter of a mile apart, and between us ran a lonely little road crossed by another like it. Our parents believed that It was safe for us, or for any child, to traverse this road between our houses, alone at any hour. We had done it from our youngest days. It should have been safe, for we were far from cities and malefactors or any sort, were utterly unknown in our secluded part of the country. There were disadvantages attendant on living in such isolation, but there were advantages too. Margaret's family were simple farmer folk of sterling worth. My father was a student of some means, who could afford to let the world go by. On dark or stormy nights, sundown generally found me safe indoors for the night, spending the evening by the open fire. Moonlight nights I loved, and on nights when the moon was bright I often stayed at Margaret's house, taking advantage of my freedom to wander home alone as late as midnight. Sometimes Margaret did this too, staying late with me and going home without thought of fear. But I was the venturesome one, the one who loved to be abroad in the moonlight. Do horrors, such as came to me, march toward one from the hour of birth, so that every trait, every characteristic, is inclined to meet them? Up to my 16th birthday, my life had been like a placid stream. It had been without excitement, and almost without incident. Perhaps its very calm had made me ready for adventure. On my 16th birthday, Margaret dined at my house, and I supped with her. It was our idea of a celebration. It was October, and the night of the full moon. I did not start home until nearly midnight. I would not reach home until a little after that, but that would not matter, because my father would be asleep in bed, and in any case not worried about me or interested in the hour of my arrival. The bright colors of autumn leaves, strangely softened and dimmed in the moonlight, rose all around me. Single leaves drifted through the still air and fell at my feet. The moon had reached mid-heaven, and the sky was like purple velvet. I was happy. It was too beautiful a night to go home. It was a night to enjoy to the fullest, to wander through, going over strange roads, going farther than I had ever gone. I threw out my arms in the moonlight, posing like a picture of a dancing girl which my father had. I'd never seen a dancer, and flitted down the road. As I reached the crossroad, the sound of our clock chiming midnight drifted to my ears, and I stopped. A beautiful high-powered car stood just at the entrance to our road, its headlights off, its parking lights hardly noticeable in the brilliant moonlight. I knew it was a fine car because my father had one, and on rare occasions the fit took him to drive it. When he drove it, I went with him, and I noticed cars, for I loved them. I loved their strength and speed and their fine lines. I loved to rush through the air in my father's car, and was never happier than when I could coax him to drive the 20 miles to the state road and go fast on the perfect paving. But aside from my father's car, I had never seen a good one on these little back country roads. I stopped, although I knew I ought to go on, and as I stopped just short of the crossroad, the big car glided softly forward a few feet until it stopped, blocking the road to my father's house. My father's motor was a silent one, but this car actually moved without the slightest sound. Until now I had not seen the driver. Now I looked at him. His face was shadowy in the moonlight. Perhaps it did not catch the direct light. There was a suggestion of strong, very sharply cut features, of a smile and a deep-set gaze. My pen shakes until I can hardly write the words. But I heard the doctor say today that I had nearly reached the end of my strength, and any night with its horrors may be the end. I must control myself and think of the things I am writing down as they seemed to me at the time. I was just turned 16, and this was romance, and so I stopped and talked to him, although exchanged few words. That night he did not ask me to ride with him, and so I was less afraid. For with the romance was fear, but I answered his questions. "What is your name?" he asked, and I answered, "Leonora." "It is music in my ears," he said softly. And again I felt that this was romance. I felt it again,
when he added, "I've been looking for you for a long time." Of course, I did not dream. I did not think that he meant that. I had read novels and love stories. I knew how to take a compliment.
"Do you often pass this way as late as this?"
Something made me hesitate, but something about him, something about our meeting alone in the moonlight fascinated me. If I said no, perhaps I would never see him again. "Very often when the moon is full," I said, and moved to go around the car. In a moment the gloved hand that rested on the wheel had touched the broad brim of his hat. Another movement, and the car shot silently ahead and was gone. I ran home with a beating heart. My last words had almost made a rendezvous of the night of the next full moon. If I desired, there might be another encounter. Yet it was 2 months later when we met again. The very next full moon had been clear, cloudless, frostily cold. A lovely November night. But that night I was afraid. I was so afraid that I even avoided the full light of the moon. When I crossed our yard in the early evening to bring in a book I had left lying outside. At the thought of traversing the road that led to Margaret's house, every instinct within me rebelled. At midnight I was lying in my bed, with the covers drawn close around me, and my wide open eyes turned resolutely away from the patch of moonlight that lay deathly white beneath my open window. I was like a person in a nervous fit. I, who had never known the meaning of nerves. But the second month it was different. After all, it was a fine thing to have mystery and romance for the taking. Mine. Or were they mine for the taking? Perhaps the man in the long, low car had never come again. Would never come again. But his voice had promised something different. Would he be there tonight? Had he been there a month ago? Curiosity began to drive me before it. After all, he had made no move to harm me, and there had been something about him, something that drew and drew me. Surely my childish fears were the height of folly, the product of my loneliness. I went to Margaret's and stayed late, almost as on that other night, until the clock struck 12. At last, with a self-consciousness that was noticeable only to me, I wrapped my heavy coat around me and went out into the night. The night had changed. It was bitterly cold, and there was a heavy, freezing mist in the air, which lay thickly in the hollows. The shadows of the bare trees struck through the dismal vapors like dangling limbs of skeletons. What am I writing, thinking of? The scream that pierced the night I could not suppress. I must control myself, or they will come and silence me. And I must finish this tonight. I must finish it before the hour of dawn. That is the hour I fear worse than the hour of midnight. It is the hour when those outside must seek their dreadful homes. The hour when striking fleshless fingers against my window pane is not enough, but they would take me with them where they go. Where I, but not another living soul, have been before, and whence I shall never escape again. I walked down slowly toward the crossroad. I would not have lingered. I would have been glad to find the crossroad empty. It was not. There stood the car, black. I had not noticed its color before. Low-hung, spectral fingers of white light from its cowl lights piercing the mist. The crossroad was in the hollow, and the mist lay very heavily there, so heavily that I could hardly breathe. He was there in the car, his face more indistinct in the shadow of his broad-brimmed hat than it had been before, I thought, his gloved hand resting as before upon the wheel. And again, with a thrill of fear, there went a thrill of fascination through me. He was different from everyone else, I felt. Strangeness, romance, and his manner was that of a lover. In my inexperience, I knew it.
"Will you ride tonight, Leonora?"
It had come. The next advance, the invitation. But I was not going with him. I had got the thrill I had come for. He had asked me, and that was enough. It was enough now if I never saw him again. This was a better stopping point. Remember that I was only 16. A stranger had come out of the night, had been mysteriously attracted to me, and I to him. He had asked me to ride with him. I do not know what I said. Somehow I must have communicated to him what I felt. My pleasure in being asked, my refusal. His gloved hand touched his hat in the farewell gesture I remembered.
Another night, Leonora. Leonora.
The car glided forward and was gone. But the echo of his voice was in my ears. His voice, deep, strange, different, but the voice of a lover. My inexperience was sure. And already I doubted if, after all, this would be enough for me, if I never saw him again. Another time he would be as punctilious, as little urgent, but he might say... What would he say? The January moon we hardly saw. So bitter were the storms of that winter, so unbreaking the heavy clouds that shut us from the sky. The February full moon was crystal clear in a sky of icy light. The snow-covered ground sparkled, and the branches of the trees were ice-coated and burned with white fire. But I clung to the fireside and again crept early within my blankets, drawing them over my head. I was in the grip of the fear that had visited me before. I was like a person in the grip of a phobia, such as they say that I have now, shunning the moonlight and the open air. It was March. Next month would bring the spring, and then would follow summer. The world would be a soft and gentle world again, in which fear would have no place. Yet I began to long for a repetition of the meetings at the crossroad, a repetition that should have the same setting, the rigors of winter, rather than the entirely different surroundings of the season of new buds and new life. My last attack of unreasoning terror had passed away again, and again it seemed as though it left behind it a reaction that urged me, more strongly than ever, toward adventure. Had he been at the crossroad in the bitter storms of January, and on the sparkling white night which I spent close indoors? Would he be there on the night of the next full moon, the March moon? There was still no breath of spring in the air on that night. The winter snow lay in the hollows, no longer whitely sparkling, but spoiled by the cold rains that had come since it had fallen. The night sky was wild with wind-torn clouds, and the moonlight was now clear and brilliant, now weirdly dim, and again swept away by great, black, sweeping shadows. The air was full of the smell of damp earth and rotted leaves. I did not go to Margaret's. I sat by the fire, dreaming strange dreams, while the clock ticked the hours slowly by, and the fire sank low. At 11 my father yawned and went up to his room. At 12:15 I took my heavy cloak and wrapped it around me. A little later, I went out. I knew that I would find him waiting. There was no doubt of that tonight. It was not curiosity that drove me, but some deeper urge, some urge I know no name for. I was like a swimmer in a dangerous current, caught at last by the undertow. The car stood in the crossroad, low and dark. Although it was a finely made machine, I was sure, it seemed to me for the first time to be in some way very peculiar. But at that moment a cloud swept across the face of the moon, and I lost interest in the matter, with the last vague thought that it must be a foreign make. Then suddenly I was aware that for the first time the stranger had opened the door of the car before me. Indeed, this was the first time I had approached on the side of the vacant seat beside the driver. "We ride tonight, Leonora. Why not? Why not? And what else did you come out for?" That was true. For the first time I now met him, not on my way home, not on my way anywhere. I had met him only to meet him, and he expected me to ride. He had never forced or tried to urge me, but tonight he expected me to ride. Wouldn't it seem silly to have come out only to exchange 2 or 3 words and go back? And wouldn't it be better to go with him? A less inexperienced girl might take the trouble to leave her house on a stormy March night for the sake of a real adventure. Only a very green country girl would have come out at all for less. I would go. I had entered the car. I sat beside him, and when the moon shone out brightly, I tried to study his face as he started the car down the narrow road. I met with no success. I had become conscious of a burning anxiety to see more clearly what was the manner of this man who had been the subject of so much speculation, the reason of so many dreams. But here beside him I could see him no more clearly than I had seen him from the road. The side of his face which was turned toward me, and which was partly exposed between the deep-brimmed hat and the turned-up collar of his cloak, was still deeply shaded by the car itself, so that I had the same elusive impression as before, of strong, sharp features, a deep-set gaze, a smiling expression. We drove fast, over strange roads. So closely was my attention centered upon my companion that I did not concern myself with the way we went. Later I was to become uneasy over the distance we had traversed, but when I did he reassured me, and I believed that we were then on our way home, and nearly there. I thought he meant by home my father's house, and had I not thought that, my wildest nightmare could not have whispered to me what it was that he called home. He was very silent. I spoke little, and he seldom answered me. That did not alarm me as it might have done, because of my ever-present conviction of my childishness, my crudeness. I blamed myself because my remarks were so stupid that they were not worth a reply, and the taciturnity that so embarrassed me yet added to the fascination that made me sit motionless hour after hour, longing more than anything else in the world to get a good look at the face beside me, to arouse more interest in my companion. Once only he spoke of his own accord. He asked me why I was called Leonora. I asked him if he did not think it was a pretty name, remembering how he had said at our first meeting that it was music in his ears. But I was disappointed, for he did not compliment my name again. Some would say it was an ill-starred name, but luckily people are not superstitious as they used to be. If that is lucky, you cannot call it ill-starred. I wanted to provoke him into talking more to me. I wanted his attention, but he did not answer me. I cannot go on. I cannot finish my story as I intended to do, telling things as they happened in their right order. There are things I must explain, things that people have said about me that I must deny, and the night is growing late, and the rapping I hear all night long upon my window pane between the bars that shut me in, but that will soon protect me no longer, is growing louder as the dawn approaches. The pain in my heart, of which the doctors said I would die soon, is growing unendurable. And when I come to the end of my story, to the end which I will set down, I do not know what will happen then. But that which I am to write of is so dreadful that I have never dared to think of it. Not of that itself, but of the horrible ending to the story I am telling. I must finish before the dawn, for it is at the dawn that they must go, and it is then that they would take me, where he waits for me, always at dawn. But to explain first, people say I am mad. You who will read this will doubtless believe them, but tell me this. Where was I from the time I disappeared from my father's house until I was found, mad, as they say, and clutching in my frenzied grasp the finger of a skeleton? In what dread struggle did I tear that finger loose, and from what dreadful hand? And although I, a living woman, could not remain in the abode of death, if I had not been touched by the very finger of death, then tell me this, why is my flesh like the flesh of the dead, so that the doctors say it is like leprous flesh? Although it is not leprous, would God it were. Now let me go on. Our silent drive continued through the flying hours. Flying hours, for I was unconscious of the lapse of time, except for the once when I vaguely became uneasy at our long journey, and was reassured. Had he who sat behind the wheel refused to answer my questioning then? Perhaps I would then have become frantic with terror. But his deep, soothing voice worked a spell on me once more, and in his reply I thought I could detect a real solicitude which comforted me. I was assured that we would shortly reach my father's house. I would slip in before my father could possibly have waked, and avoid questioning. As the night grew older, it became more dismal. The moon, which had swung high overhead, sent long shadows, scurrying from every tree and shrub, every hill and hummock, as we dashed by. The wind had fallen, but yet blew hard enough to make a moaning, wailing sound which seemed to follow us through the night. The clouds that had swept in great masses across the sky had changed their shapes, and trailed in long, somber, broken streamers, like torn black banners. The smell of dank, soggy earth and rotting leaves, of mold and decay, was heavier since the wind had sunk a little. Suddenly I had a great need for reassurance and comfort. My heart seemed breaking with loneliness and with a strange, unreasoning despair. I turned to the silent figure at my side, and it seemed that he smelled of the stagnant odor of decay that filled the night, that the smell and the oppression were heavier because I had leaned nearer to him. I looked with a more intense gaze than I had yet turned on him, not at the face that bent above me now, the face that still eluded and baffled me, but down at the arm next to me, at the sleeve of his cloak of heavy black cloth. For something had caught my eye. Something moved. Oh, what was this horror, and why was it so horrible? A slowly moving worm upon his sleeve. I shuddered so that I clashed my teeth together. I must control myself. And then, as though my deep alarm were the cue for the hidden event to advance from the future upon me, the car was gliding to a stop. I tore my horrified gaze from the black-clad arm and looked out of the car. We were gliding into a cemetery. "Not here. Oh, don't stop here." I gasped the words as one gasps in a nightmare.
"Yes, here."
The deep voice was deeper. It was deep and hollow. There was no comfort in it. The mask was off my fear, at least. I was face to face with that, though I had not yet seen that other face. I leaped from the car and fell fainting beside it, black, low-hung and long and narrow. I had been to but one funeral in my life, but I knew it now. It was the shape of a coffin. After that I had no hope. I was with a madman, or... He dragged me in gloved hands through which the hard, long fingers bruised my flesh. Past graves, past tombstones and marble statues, and I was numb. I saw among the graves, or seemed to see. Oh, let me say I saw strange things, for I have seen them since, and I was numb. He dragged me toward an old sunken grave, headed by a time-stained stone that settled to one side, so long it had marked that spot. And suddenly the nightmare dreaminess that had dulled my senses gave way to some keener realization of the truth. I struggled. I fought back with all my little strength till I tore the glove from his right hand, and the finger of his right hand snapped in my grasp, snapped and gave way. I struggled in the first faint rays of dawn, struggled as I felt the old sunken earth give way beneath my feet, and the sun rose over the edge of the earth and flamed red into my desperate eyes. I turned for a last time to the inscrutable face, and in those blood-red rays of the dawn I saw at last revealed the grinning, fleshless jaws, the empty eye sockets of... Statement by the Superintendent of St. Margaret's Insane Asylum. This document was found in the room of Leonora, who was pronounced dead of heart failure by the resident physician. Attendants who rushed to the room on hearing wild cries and who found her dead believed the fatal attack to have been caused by the excitement of writing down her extraordinary narration. The doctor who had attended her considered her the victim of a strange form of auto-hypnosis,
She undoubtedly disappeared from her home on the night of the 18th of March, and was found 2 days later in an old cemetery 300 miles away. When found, she was incoherent and hysterical, and was holding in her hand the finger of a skeleton. How and where she might have come by this, it was and is impossible to surmise. It seems, however, that she must have been lured from her home by some stranger and have escaped or been abandoned near the cemetery, that she must have read of the legend of Leonora, and that it must have made a morbid impression on her mind, which later, following the shock which caused her to lose her reason, dictated the form her insanity was to take. It is true that her skin, from the time of her discovery in the graveyard, had a peculiar appearance suggestive of the skin of a leprous person, or even more of that of a corpse. And, which she does not mention, it also exuded a peculiar odor. These phenomena were among those attributed by the doctor to the effects of auto-hypnosis, his theory being that, just as a hypnotized person may be made to develop a burn on the arm by the mere suggestion without the application of heat, Leonora had suggested to herself that she had been contaminated by the touch of death, and that her physical nature had been affected by the strength of the suggestion. End of Section 5, Leonora. End of The Canal and Leonora by Everil Worrell.